My aspect in this program will be more about perhaps what's going on and my views about trade and exports and what I'm trying to accomplish with my colleagues in Washington, D.C. In regard to the Kansas economy and the value of exports and trade. First of all, I mean, there's been a long series, mostly what's been talked about, of events, of issues that have arisen regarding trade and exports. And most of what we've seen so far relates to tariffs. That is a component of the discussion and debate and circumstances we face in Washington, D.C. But in my view, this issue about trade really started from a policy point of view with TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Trump administration made the decision, and it's what candidate Trump said in his campaign, that TPP was a bad agreement and we wouldn't complete the negotiations in that regard. And upon becoming president, we withdrew from those negotiations. That involved a number of countries in South America and mostly the Asian region. And in my view, we have lost markets and access to opportunities in Kansas and around the country as a result of not participating in TPP. And then also, in a similar vein, NAFTA. NAFTA was the agreement a long time ago between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and allowed for exports and imports among those three countries. And it is being renegotiated. The president indicated that he would like to have a better deal, a more modern deal, and one that eliminated the issue that more was coming in or out of one country or the other, the comparison. I would tell you, as a Kansan, Mexico is the #1 purchaser of agriculture commodities from our state. Canada is number 2 or 3, depending upon the year. In my view, nothing wrong with negotiating a new, updated agreement, one that better reflects perhaps the circumstances of the day. But my hope is, and I have concern that this is the plan, my hope is at the end of those negotiations, there's actually an agreement that is put in place. In both of these instances of trade agreements, the administration is, the president indicated this in his campaign. He doesn't like multinational agreements. He wants bilateral agreements. And so in this case with TPP, the administration is attempting to negotiate a bilateral agreement with Japan, which is a part of TPP, and Japan is saying, no, you had your chance to negotiate with us as part of a larger package of countries. So I'm all for bilateral agreements. I'm all for negotiating every trade agreement that we can attain that makes sense between two countries, but that needs to be in place. Those results need to be happening for us to get the benefits today and not just have the detriment of not being in TPP or not being a part of NAFTA or NAFTA going away. Same thing with NAFTA. The current indications are, and I've heard this from President Trump himself, is that reaching an agreement with Mexico seems possible, but not with Canada. And I don't know what Mexico's position is if it can be a bilateral agreement, but there is those conversations going that we might get an agreement with Mexico, but NAFTA would go by the wayside. Then, on top of that, we have tariffs, and those tariffs come about in a number of ways. National security was mentioned as one. Retaliatory tariffs, or who starts the tariff battle, and those generally involve, again, Canada, Mexico, but now the European Union, European countries, and also China. All of that is the background of the things that we are needing to consider, are considering in Washington, D.C. But in every opportunity as a senator who represents Kansans, the message that I've delivered to President Trump and to people within the administration, including the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, the Trade Ambassador, Robert Lighthizer, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Perdue, and Robert Kudlow, the economic advisor to the President, is at the end of the day, we have to have the opportunity to export or we will not earn a living in Kansas. And again, agriculture we often think as the poster child of this issue, and in many ways it is true. I've had over the years of representing Kansans, even farmers who would tell me, let's forget the rest of the world. Let's just take care of ourselves and it would be much simpler, much easier than dealing with the rest of the world. A lot of truth, perhaps, to the easiness of that. But for example, if we don't export wheat, a pretty important commodity, a pretty important way that we earn a living, the question then becomes, what 48% of acres that are now planted to wheat in Kansas do we no longer plant, and do we no longer grow, and do we no longer harvest, and do we no longer get the income for? So particularly if a farmer says, forget the world, we can produce, and we do produce, so much more than we can consume in the United States. Where we get a chance at profitability in agriculture is very much related to who we sell to around the globe. And then in regard to outside of agriculture, this is an issue especially for manufacturers, and especially for small manufacturers who use aluminum and steel. And you heard about the economics, the rising prices, the consequence to consumers, the consequence of moving your business outside of the United States to avoid the tariffs. What that means is, yes, one less business, but what it means is one fewer employer hiring Kansans and hiring Americans. I spoke on the Senate floor the other night about Chanute Manufacturing, Chanute, Kansas. Their tariffs, the increase in tariffs mean they're not competitive. They make products for the utility, for generation of electricity, for power plants. And they are not competitive. And that means their price is higher compared to others that they compete with. It has meant to them they've lost the opportunity to enter into agreements and sell, in this case, to Morocco, because the tariffs mean their product costs more. And so the tariff issue, in my view, there are reasons for us to deal with China, to attempt to deal with China. They steal our trade secrets. They attack us in cyber, and they steal our intellectual property. But a general tariff war is not the solution to that problem. And we ought to be united with the rest of the world. At the moment, we have picked at least trade fights with Canada, Mexico, the European countries, and the Pacific, where if we were united, I think there would be agreement that China is misbehaving, and we could work together to change China's behavior instead of having a series of trade issues ongoing all at the same time. From a legislative point of view, there's been efforts to rein in any administration from having the sole authority to impose tariffs. That legislation hasn't received a vote in the United States Senate, and that's the tariffs that are related to national security, Section 232 tariffs. But beyond that legislative attempt, mostly it has been conversations with the president and his administration, trying to convince them about perhaps a different way or a better way to deal with the rest of the world than get into a trade fight with our northern border country and our southern border country, Europe and China. I and a number of my colleagues, this is not intended to be a partisan statement, and often there is complaints by some that Republicans don't push back on the White House sufficiently. In this instance, I think it is generally Republicans, but it's not just Republicans who have been the most vocal in regard to trade and in regard to tariffs. And so there have been conversations in my case so that my constituents know my efforts. I don't read my Facebook comments anymore because they're not pleasant to read, but I notice that I get frowning faces whenever in addition to thumbs up, I get a frowning face whenever I talk about trade. And I talk about it in a way of we need to make certain we have trade, we need to make certain we reach agreements, and we need to get out of a tariff battle in order for Kansas to have a future. The timing of this battle, what's going on with trade and tariffs, is especially difficult in agriculture today because commodity prices are historically low, farmer income is significantly down. The drought across much of Kansas has created huge challenges for the prosperity of farmers and ranchers, and the uncertainty that occurs when we don't know what those markets are. Soybean prices have dropped $2 a bushel. In my hometown of Plainville, the grain sorghum price dropped 99 cents the first day a bushel when the tariffs that China announced retaliating against our tariffs occurred. Just to take a step back to agriculture, agriculture is in the crosshairs because it's the easiest place for other countries to retaliate and put tariffs on our products and reduce the export opportunities that we have. A challenge for us in agriculture is that we are not the only provider. Incidentally, Mexico, their Secretary of Commerce has met with me, and I understand their motivation. They would want to portray a battle with Mexico as a very negative thing for Kansans and for Americans to me. But what they told me, I think, is worth repeating, which is we have found markets, we have found the ability to purchase agriculture commodities to the tune of 80% of what we buy from the United States today elsewhere. Now again, that's a message they would want to deliver to me, to have me concerned about Kansans and agriculture. But with Argentina and Brazil, little question but what that is likely, is possible. So we have a lot to lose. Now, the administration has announced a $12 billion opportunity for farmers. We don't know any of the details of this, but presumably there's going to be $12 billion available to compensate farmers and ranchers for their losses. The ability to compensate for those losses the losses will be significantly more than $12 billion. You cannot overcome the volume of income that we earn in trade with a government program. Farmers generally, while I would guess many would say we will take the money, it's not what they tell me they want. They want the markets. And most importantly to me, we have spent lots of effort and money, private dollars as well as federal taxpayer dollars, securing these markets, pursuing these markets. And the problem is that when and if the tariff battle comes to an end, how do we get the customers back that were buying agriculture and manufactured goods from Kansas and the United States after they've been buying someplace else? In this audience, I've said this in Washington, D.C., and I kind of get the blank look because I'm not sure that people understand my point, but maybe this audience would understand. I've been in lots of circumstances where a rural community in Kansas has lost its physician. That physician leaves the community and people are without a doctor. So people in the community start looking for someplace else to receive medical care. And in the case of communities that surround Salina, those patients may now be coming to Salina. So the community has the effort to recruit a new physician. They want to keep a doctor in their community for obvious reasons. They want that doctor or doctors to support their hometown hospital. But when that new doctor is recruited and arrives in that small town, the patients are already found a doctor and developed a relationship someplace else. And then the struggle becomes, how do we get our patients back to our own community? To me, it's the analogy that we face in agriculture in particular, but in manufacturing as well. So when this comes to an end, and people have already, other countries and businesses and consumers elsewhere are buying elsewhere than the United States, then do we have to go into this marketing program to try to bring those customers back to the United States? So $12 billion will not solve the problem of the future. It doesn't cover the losses today, and it means that we don't have the customers that we need when the $12 billion goes away in the future. So my efforts have been related to, I chair a subcommittee that funds the Department of Commerce, so we've had Secretary Wilbur Ross in front of us, conversations, discussion, questions about trade and exports. I chair a subcommittee that funds USTR, the trade ambassador, and just last week we had Bob Lighthizer in front of our committee. Almost without exception, every member of the committee, Republican and Democrat, if you were gauging their questions, they were critical of what was happening at USTR in regard to trade and exports. And then I would tell you that a handful of us Republican senators went to the White House, I would guess this is now a couple months ago, and met with President Trump and made some of the things that I've talked about, those points to the president. The president was surprised, he indicated he was surprised that we were telling him we don't want a payment. We want trade, not any number of dollar payment. He said, I've never met members of Congress who don't come here asking for money for their constituents. We were not asking for money. In fact, we were suggesting that trade is the better solution to this than another government program. And my point to the president was what I said to you earlier, could we narrow the scope of our battles around the globe and deal much more directly with China, with other allies in our corner, and try to deal with the intellectual property issue, the cybersecurity attacks, and stealing our trade secrets. Incidentally, the president said in that meeting, instructed Kudlow, and Kudlow then turned to Lighthizer. The president's instructions were, let's go negotiate TPP and see if we can't get back in. 2 days later, there was a tweet that says TPP is a bad agreement. So it lasted a little bit. But again, the efforts are underway constantly to try to encourage, educate, describe to this administration why trade and exports are important to us. And secondly, there's a legislative effort, and I mentioned the 232 giving Congress more authority. The Constitution puts trade in the hands of Congress, and through our legislation, we have delegated that authority generally to the executive branch, long before President Trump was president. And there is some effort afoot to try to bring that authority back where it originally rested under the Constitution. And most recently, in conversations with my colleagues, there is a belief that there might be a trade agreement with Mexico, excluding China. And the question is, the legal question is, who can terminate NAFTA? I don't think there's a legal answer, a known answer to that question, but you could see the scenario, at least there are those who see the scenario in which we negotiate an agreement with Mexico and NAFTA is then forgotten, and Congress is then asked to ratify the agreement with Mexico, and we haven't done anything to deal with Canada and the three countries together. So legally, uncertainty, as you would expect in Washington, D.C., and a political path that allows those kind of issues to be resolved with Congress having more authority when you would expect the president probably would veto any legislation that gave more authority to Congress and took authority away from the executive branch, which means you'd have to have 2/3 of senators and 2/3 of House members to actually pass legislation that could become law, which is, it's hard enough to get 51, it's difficult to get 60, and 67 in the Senate is, that's a pretty high hurdle. So not a realistic, probably not a realistic opportunity. I feel I've wandered all over the place, but I'd be glad to respond to. I'm going to take questions on other issues as well. But if we could deal with the trade folks, and maybe we could get Zach and the experts up here to have questions for them. But if we could talk about trade for a minute, then I'd be glad to take questions about other topics after that.